Hello, and welcome back to History, the HSC, where we are continuing our study into the dictatorships that arose during the interwar period. This is our fifth video in the power and authority topic for modern history, and you'll find that we are trialing out a new look. The purpose of this design change is to make videos that will double as a poster or a handout that you can download, that you can print out for free using the link below in the description. Today we are studying a somewhat unusual dictatorship, the Japanese dictatorship. It varies in several significant ways from the European ones that we've already looked at, lacking the same level of terror and oppression and with the absence of any clear dictator. Another reason the study of this dictatorship is different is we're going a little bit deeper in order to cover some different syllabus outcomes that are relevant only to Japan. This video will examine the following syllabus points. Firstly, the conditions that enabled dictators to rise to power in the interwar period. Secondly, an overview of the features of the dictatorships that emerged in Russia, Italy, and Japan, obviously today focusing in on Japan. And thirdly, a new dot point that we haven't covered so far, the ambitions of Germany in Europe and Japan in Asia Pacific. As usual, we will be breaking our topic into 4 bite-sized chunks. The first of which will be the situation, where we will discover what was happening in Japan in the lead up to the dictatorship. What were the political and economic issues that predicated the evolution of this military dictatorship? Secondly, we'll spend some time considering the features of this dictatorship. Here in particular, we will see the stark differences between Japan and the European dictatorships of Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin. Thirdly, we're going to consider the imperial ambitions of Japan in the Asia-Pacific region, focusing largely on the concept of Hakio Ichiu, and apologies there for my Japanese pronunciation, and how that the same imperialistic desires that drove European powers in this period were also at work in Japan. And lastly, we will see these imperial ambitions at work through the various invasions the Japanese army and navy undertook in the Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, and the invasion of Manchuria, sparking off the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. So I hope you're ready for this. Let's get started with our deep dive into the ambitions and the features of the Japanese dictatorship. In 1868, Japan left behind its feudal system in what became known as the Meiji Restoration. When US Admiral Matthew Perry arrived at the coast of Japan in 1853, the Tokugawa shogunate realized that their days were numbered. The shogunate had placed Japan into self-imposed isolationism for over 200 years, but the arrival of US warships, far outclassing anything available in Japan at the time, demonstrated that Japan needed to be opened. Perry demanded that Japan be opened for trade. The shogunate, of course, had no choice but to submit. Fundamentally, this weakened them and allowed supporters of the emperor to take power in Japan. They rightly feared the sort of European colonization that was quickly weakening the Qing Empire in China. The Meiji Restoration saw Japan modernize rapidly as the government became increasingly centralized and industrialized. In 1875, 600,000 tons of coal was produced in Japan. By 1913, this had grown to 21.3 million tons. In 1873, Japan had only 26 merchant ships plying international trade. By 1913, this had grown to over 1,500. In 1872, Japan had 29 kilometers of railway. By 1914, this had grown to 11,400 kilometers. This modernization drive was founded largely around the importance of military reform. Japan's modernization was built upon the European model, incorporating European military organizations, education systems, governments, and nationalistic tendencies. The Meiji Constitution was adopted in 1889 and was a strange mixture of absolute monarchy and constitutional monarchy. The emperor retaining his role as head of state while the prime minister was head of the government. The population of Japan could elect representatives to form what was called the imperial diet, or parliament. The constitution provided clear links in the powers of both the emperor as well as elected representatives, with an independent judiciary and the protection of various civil rights and liberties. However, the constitution was fundamentally flawed. Only 1% of the population could actually vote for the diet, and questions continued over who held ultimate authority in Japan. Was it the emperor or elected officials? And this remained unclear and a matter of contention in Japanese society for some time. Perhaps the most problematic feature of the Meiji Constitution was the amount of direct access military commanders had to the emperor. This too would cause significant issues in the future. The newly modernized Japan had found international acceptance as a major world power by World War I, big enough to be considered one of the Big Five at the Paris Peace Conference. But despite this, they were sidelined relatively quickly, unable to push through demands for a recognition of racial equality within the League of Nations Charter, and unable to take control of German spheres of influence within China. For Japanese officials, this was yet another rebuff by Western powers, who, as we will see, were unwilling to give them territorial growth that they desired in both the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War. Let's take a moment now to consider this diagram, which shows the organization of the Meiji Constitution. Now, there were several key areas of concern within this constitution. Firstly, whilst the courts were independent of the civil government, the judges appointed to those courts were appointed by the emperor. This effectively gave the emperor complete judicial control within the state of Japan. Secondly, while some Japanese citizens could vote for the House of Representatives, remember that was only 1%, the emperor appointed the representatives in the House of Peers, the second house of the imperial diet. This effectively gave him control over what decisions the imperial diet could make. They would only pass things that the emperor wanted them to pass. This effectively gives him political control over the state of Japan. Article 11 went further, placing the emperor as commander-in-chief of both the navy and the army. He alone could give them orders, and they reported directly to him. This is most clearly seen in the Mukden incident that occurred beginning the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. The Mukden incident was a point where the Japanese did a false flag attack, pretending that Chinese people had attacked them and using that as motivation for war. The Japanese civil government was very much against this war and attempted desperately to prevent it, but they were completely powerless before a military that knew they didn't have to listen to them and knew that they would also gain more power by ignoring them. Now, Article 55 theoretically stipulated that the emperor had no legal power alone, that anything he wished to occur, any law he wished to pass, would need to be authorized by a minister of the state. However, this was barely an inconvenience. The emperor himself appointed ministers of the state. This ensured his will would be achieved. And in everything we see, judicially, politically, militarily, the emperor ruled Japan. Let's move on now to consider how the economic situation in Japan developed. Whilst it was a rapidly industrializing nation, Japan still relied heavily on trade, and as such, the worldwide Great Depression that marked the end of the 1920s caused catastrophic consequences within the state. Agricultural and textile prices plummeted worldwide. Now, this had a significant impact on Japan. The population of Japan had skyrocketed following the Meiji Restoration. It now stood at around 65 million, and they were simply unable to grow the amount of food that was required in order to feed their population. Further, silk exports, which had been a major stream of income for Japan, faltered. Western nations imposed tariffs on imported materials in an attempt to maintain their own economies, and as a result, the Japanese economy began to falter. But beyond even imports of food, Japan was heavily reliant on imports of the products of industrialization. Coal, iron, oil were all scarce in Japan, but strictly necessary for the industrialization drive to continue. The result of this, coupled with the civil government's failure at Versailles, saw the militarists in government gain increasingly more and more control. Japan began to look for military solutions for their economic and political issues. Increasingly, these waves of political violence were perpetuated by the military class, often with the tacit approval of the highest levels of military leadership. Perhaps the most significant of these events was the February 26 incident of 1936. A group of young army officers, calling themselves the Righteous Army, who at the very least believed they had the support of the senior military if they did not in fact have it, seized government power in the center of government power in Tokyo, assassinating two former prime ministers and attempting to assassinate the current prime minister. Now, it's important to note that this was not the first example of this sort of political violence. These were not the first army officers who had murdered elected officials. They were, however, the first to suffer the implications and punishment of it. The officers desired to overthrow the government and place the emperor back in full control. Beyond this, they seemed to have no real plans. They were loyal to the emperor and presumed he could come up with what needed to happen next. This loyalty, unfortunately for them, was misplaced. The emperor wanted nothing to do with the attempted coup d'etat, demanding that they be brought to justice. The army would move in, and on the 29th of February, these rebels would surrender. Given the chance to commit suicide, some would take up the offer. Others were put on trial, found guilty. As we zoom in here on this photograph, we need to consider the level of support these officers really do appear to have from the highest levels of the military. There had been previous military violence against government, and those who committed those acts had been protected and not punished. Indeed, the generals appear to have tried to avoid even acting against the Righteous Army at all, only sending in the army when the emperor threatened to lead the assault himself. The February 26 incident brought to an end the period of political assassinations within Japan. This wasn't because the military had lost its political influence. Rather, it was because the military had gained more power and more influence. The civil government under Prime Minister Okada would resign in March, and the military would successfully push for the involvement of active military leadership within the civil government for the first time. Previously, only retired military leaders had held positions within the central government. In effect, what this means is the military had gained veto power over the decisions made by the civil government and the ability to destroy a government if and when they chose. This would quickly lead to the development of the military dictatorship in Japan. So let's now move on to consider the features of the dictatorship in Japan. A key factor here in achieving strong marks in any question in your HSC is not just understanding what the common features of each dictatorship were, but actually what distinguishes them all from each other. And here, the Japanese military dictatorship does stand apart, as unlike any of the dictatorships of Stalin or Mussolini that we've seen earlier, even unlike the dictatorship of Hitler, there was no clear, identifiable, and charismatic leader behind whom a cult of personality could be built. So who are the contenders for leadership within Japan during this time period? The first option is Tojo, the prime minister at the time. Now, Hideaki Tojo was a general in the Imperial Japanese Army, one noted for both loyalty to the emperor and a pro-war stance when it came to China. When Tojo was appointed prime minister in 1941, the war in China had slowed already to a stalemate, the previous government having resigned over their inability to conduct the war successfully. It was hoped Tojo's noted hardline attitude would enable him to find a solution to the China problem quickly. Tasked with reviewing the situation, Tojo would go on to increase Japanese activity within China and to further expand Japanese war efforts, attacking Pearl Harbor and Malaya, joining the war against the Allies, and bringing the United States into the war. But to call this Tojo's military dictatorship would perhaps be an unfair accusation. Militarism within Japan far predated Tojo's rise to power. Militarists had held significant power since the February 26th incident, which was in 1936, and even before that. The Imperial Rule Association had been formed in 1940, again before Tojo came to power, dissolving independent political parties and forming a one-party state for the duration of the war. Perhaps it would be even better to question whether Tojo really held dictatorial power in the first place. As general in the army, he certainly exercised a significant amount of power, but cliques within the Japanese military led to fierce competition between the Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy. The reality was Tojo had little to no control over the actions of the Navy due to the inter-service rivalry that dominated the period. An example of this was that it took the Navy 2 weeks to announce to the Army and the government their loss at Midway, the turning point in the Pacific War. Regardless of these facts, Tojo was certainly viewed as responsible for the war and the Japanese atrocities by the Allies following Japanese surrender. But a second option would be to consider the Emperor Hirohito as the dictator of Japan during this period. We've already seen how the Meiji Constitution gave him considerable power, politically, judicially, and militarily in decision-making. Hirohito's role in Japanese rule has been a matter of debate amongst historians in recent years. Initially, following the Japanese surrender, the political reality of requiring Hirohito's support to ensure the Japanese state would survive necessitated the US forces working with him. In the newly forming Cold War period, the fear of Japan turning communist was a far more pressing matter, and as such, Hirohito would never be tried, never be convicted of any war crimes. And accounts at the time would seek to paint him as a pacifist, unable to rule over the desires of the militarists in the government, people like Tojo, who were the real power. And this belief would continue at least until his death in 1989. His state funeral was attended by royalty from throughout the world, the US President, the Secretary General of the United Nations, even representatives from the Soviet Union. At the time, this was the largest ever gathering of world leaders. However, since his death, historiographical work has begun to cast far more questions onto this presumed innocence of Hirohito. Now, these modern arguments point out several things. Firstly, Hirohito's ability to end the February 26th incident. Secondly, his decision to appoint Tojo to the post of Prime Minister, despite opposition. And thirdly, Hirohito's approval of the use of chemical weapons in China. All of these things Hirohito did himself. Further, Hirohito has been accused of being aware of Japanese war crimes in terms of the treatment of prisoners of war and also the rape of Nanking. In all of these, his choice of inaction, when he seems to have had the power to bring those responsible to justice, implies at least a tacit approval of their action. Beyond all of this, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, which, to be fair, was begun without imperial authority, would later be given that imperial authority when Hirohito was convinced they would be victorious. And further, the attack on Pearl Harbor, which Hirohito himself approved of. So who is the dictator in Japan? Is there even one clear dictator? Or is this a case of a military dictatorship without a clear leader? I'll leave it up to you to make that call. I do believe that the argument could be made both ways. A second distinguishing factor of the military dictatorship in Japan is the amount of popular nationalism. That is, the general popularity of the government, in particular Hirohito. There was no clear ideological basis to the Japanese dictatorship, unlike in Italy and Russia, beyond perhaps a promotion of traditional Japanese values and assumptions of Japanese racial superiority. Education within Japan emphasized the glory of Japan, the importance of obedience to the emperor, and this would become increasingly true following Tojo's rise to power, particularly when he also became Minister for Education in 1943. To a large extent, the military dictatorship operated with very little opposition from within the state, although, as we have seen, there was indeed rivalry and opposition amongst the highest levels of leadership within the state, particularly between the army and the navy, and perhaps, depending on your interpretation, between Tojo and the emperor himself. With a largely compliant population, the need to control them was far less a feature of the Japanese dictatorship than we have seen in Italy and Russia. From the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, the use of censorship within Japan increased. Regulations were imposed on what the press could report and how they should report it. This included censorship of any photo that could promote the Imperial Army in a negative light, particularly anything that might show the various atrocities committed by the Japanese Army and the Navy. An example of this would be the photographs shown in Japanese newspapers of the capture of Nanking, which suggested an entirely peaceful occupation. Press censorship would continue to expand throughout the war, with tighter and tighter restrictions and the closure of more magazines and newspapers. As we zoom in on the photos, we see the Japanese government censors at work. Now, these censors were important, ensuring the message remained consistent throughout Japan. Propaganda focused on themes that would help build support for the war and the popular nationalist identity. These included the uniqueness of the Japanese, Hakko Ichiu, or the imperial ambitions, and the Code of Bushido. Coupled with censorship, they were extremely effective in controlling the thoughts and opinions of the vast majority of the Japanese population. Wide-scale public support did mean that there was less need for government to use force and the threat of terror to control the population. However, there was a secret police force called the Kempeitai. Tojo himself had been an officer within it in his earlier years. And whilst they certainly were responsible for the same level of brutality of the secret police forces in Italy and the Soviet Union and in Germany, they largely worked in areas conquered by Imperial Japan rather than on the mainland itself. However, the little they did do on the mainland did help to coerce the population further to maintain solidarity and uniformity within the accepted Japanese nationalistic ideal. Japanese imperial ambitions are really much the same as many other Western imperialistic powers during the new imperialism period that spanned 1870 to 1914. Of course, one key difference here is that these ambitions would continue after World War I. The militarists who ran Japan all agreed on the need for imperial advancement. However, there was a key debate on where this advancement should occur. Initially, it focused northward in what was called the Hokushin-ron, or Northern Road. This saw Japan focus on Manchuria and Siberia as part of their sphere of influence. The doctrine enjoyed wide support of the imperial army in particular during the interwar period, but would fall out of favor, particularly following the signing of the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Act in 1941. It would be replaced by the Nanshin-ron, or Southern Road, focusing on securing land in Southeast Asia and the control of the Pacific. This would form the basis of Japanese imperial advancements and imperial ambitions during the war years. Now, the significant term we need to understand is the concept of Hakko Ichiu, which means something like all the world under one roof. Prominent in Japanese thinking, it influenced their involvement both in the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II on a wider scale. In essence, Hakko Ichiu was founded on the concept of divine right, the divine right of the Japanese to rule over the East Asian region. As can be seen from this banknote depicting a monument to this ideal, the concept of divine right of the Japanese to rule was an important nationalistic and imperialistic piece of propaganda. The origins of this ambition for imperial expansion can be traced back to Japanese failure at the Paris peace talks, failure to achieve their aims, and the failure to have the racial equality clause included in the League of Nations Charter. These incidents weakened the democracy within Japan, contributing to the rise of militarism and ultranationalism, as we've already seen. And along this came with the increased importance of this divine right in Japanese political thinking. The divine right of the Japanese to rule was also clearly based on the concept of ethnocentrism, the belief in Japan at the time of the superiority of the Japanese race. As part of this, the monument depicted in this banknote was built to commemorate the 2600th anniversary of the founding of Japan. By way of understanding this ethnocentrism and its impact on Japan, have a listen to this extract from the book Evil Men by James Dawes. It's a recount of a Japanese soldier involved in World War II, and it gives a clear description of how propaganda and nationalism, the propaganda and nationalism that we saw in the features of this dictatorship, gave rise to a racist ideology that drove many of the worst successes of the Japanese military. I also need to note before I read this quote, it does contain several incredibly racist terms that I obviously disagree with. However, they do give a clear indication of the thought process of the Japanese soldiers at the time. So, quote, public education, they drove loyalty and patriotism, that sort of ideology home. In other words, what does it mean? It means that the country of Japan is, well, the country of God. It is the absolute best country in the world, that the idea was thoroughly planted into us. If you turn it over, it means to despise other races. That's the sort of ideology it is. And from the time we were small, we called Chinese people dirty chinks, made fun of them. We called Russians rusky pigs. We called Westerners hairy barbarians, And so this meant that when the people of Japan joined the army and went to the front, no matter how many Chinese they killed, they didn't think of them as being much different to killing a dog or a cat. End quote. Another key aspect of Japanese imperial ambitions was the emulation of the West. From the Meiji Restoration onward, Japan had imitated Western government systems, military systems. It functioned much like other similar Western powers, and in the same way that Western powers had seen imperial advancement as a sign of their power and their influence, Japan too saw a growing empire as something they needed to achieve. This was only heightened by the Western powers' refusal to allow them to achieve what they desired. It can be clearly seen through the Versailles Treaty, but also through the Sino-Japanese War and Russo-Japanese War that we'll look at soon. No doubt this was made worse by Britain's territorial gains after World War I, receiving German colonies in Africa and the Middle East. France would also receive colonies in the Middle East. Even Australia would gain territory, receiving the German colony of Papua New Guinea. But the refusal of Western powers to allow Japan to receive this same territorial advancement pushed them further and further down the path of militarism and the desire to achieve territorial ambitions despite whatever the West may think. A movement that would culminate in Japan leaving the League of Nations and embarking on expansionistic campaigns. We've already seen how the modernization of the Meiji period brought with it massive industrialization in Japan. This brought them great power, but did provide difficulties in terms of the provision of raw materials. The invasion of China, in particular, was primarily an invasion designed to meet this resource need. 300 million tons of iron ore from the region of northern China and Manchuria being desperately required for the production of steel. Along with this, the requirement of oil, a resource almost completely absent in Japan but abundant in Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, two areas that Japan would take control of under Nanshin-Ron. In the end, it is hardly surprising that Japan came under the control of the militarists. They looked for increasingly military solutions to their problems, both real and imagined. These military solutions saw Japan set out to create an empire for itself, one in which they believed they had the divine right to rule. Let's take a moment now to consider a few examples of invasions that demonstrate these territorial ambitions of Japan during this period. We'll start with the first Sino-Japanese conflict, or Sino-Japanese War, beginning in 1894. In essence, this came down to questions over spheres of influence in Korea. Korea had operated as a satellite state of the Qing dynasty in China, but as the power of Japan grew increasingly, the two came into conflict over the future of the Korean state. This particularly became an issue as Russia became increasingly involved in East Asian affairs, and control over the Korean peninsula became an increasingly hot issue in international politics. In 1894, an attempted coup d'etat occurred in Korea, which overthrew the imperial rule of China and sought closer relations with Japan. This coup had the tacit approval of Japan, but there was little in the way, initially at least, of military support. And for a moment at least, there was a pause to see who would act first. In Japan, the decision was made not to send troops unless the Chinese first acted. China would send 1,500 troops to Korea in order to stabilize the region, Japan acting second, sending far more, 7,000 troops, leading, of course, to their victory. The stark differences between the rapidly modernizing Japan and the Qing, who were woefully underprepared, made for a quick and unprecedented victory for Japan. Now, as we zoom in on the cartoon, we get a clear indication of how Western powers viewed this coming conflict. It was expected that Japan would lose. China was a larger nation, and whilst European powers had defeated them and forced them into a series of unequal treaties following the Opium Wars, it was not believed that Japan was in a position to challenge the Qing. We see the two nations as roosters about to fight, China, the larger, seemingly likely to win. Regardless, the Eurocentric view of this cartoon is made clear by the depiction of the Russian bear in the background. To the European powers, whoever won in this coming battle, the Russians would simply crush. To the Europeans, the thought that Japan could challenge Russia, or even the Qing, was frankly laughable. The underlying racism inherent in the diplomatic relations of the world at the time blinded European commentators and politicians from the physical reality of the impact of the Meiji Restoration and modernization that it had brought to Japan. So in the end, really, it is hardly surprising the Japanese won this easy victory. Following the war, the Japanese imposed harsh terms on the defeated Qing. They were forced to cede the Liaodong Peninsula, Taiwan, and the Penghu Islands. On top of this, some 8 million kilograms of silver as reparations, and the opening of further Chinese ports to trade. These harsh terms saw the triple intervention of Britain, Russia, and Germany, forcing Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula, which had contained some of these European countries' assets, in return for even more reparations. In the end, the Qing would pay over 311 million yen in reparations to the Japanese. The entire war effort had only cost Japan 250 million yen, so they had actually made a profit out of it. The second event worth considering is the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Much like the earlier Sino-Japanese War, this too found its origin in competition over spheres of influence in the region, however this time in Manchuria. Russian construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway and attempts to take this through Manchuria to reach the Pacific had increased tensions in the region. These tensions had been building for some time. In 1903, Japan had offered an agreement with Russia. They would recognize Russian sphere of influence in Manchuria if the Russians in turn recognized their control and sphere of influence in Korea. The Russians at the time were unwilling to accept this deal, and so the tensions continued to build. On the 8th of February 1905, the Japanese would begin this war, attacking the Russian-controlled port of Port Arthur, without any official declaration of war. Initially, the Russians were confident of victory. Tsar Nicholas II, eager to distract his people from the problems at home, committed to a war in retaliation, and this was met initially with an outpouring of public support. At first, at least, it appeared that the Russian confidence was well placed. The Japanese surprise attack on Port Arthur caused no significant damage initially, and they were quickly forced away. However, from that point on, things really did fall apart for the Tsar. Two major battles really highlight the success of the Japanese army and navy in this conflict. The Battle of Mukden began on the 20th of February 1905 and would end on the 10th of March. It would be the largest individual battle in the modern era prior to World War I. 610,000 men would take part in combat, 164,000 would become casualties. The Japanese alone would fire 20 million rifle and machine gun rounds and close to 300,000 artillery shells in just 10 days. The Russian statistics were even higher. Now, these figures should have given the world pause to consider the implications of modern warfare. In the end, the Russian army would be defeated, suffering 90,000 casualties and being forced out of southern Manchuria. This defeat was a shock to the imperial court, but worse was yet to come. This would occur on the 27th the 28th of May, when the Russian Baltic Fleet arrived in the Straits of Tsushima near Japan to do battle with the Imperial Japanese Navy. Their journey had been filled with enough madness already to make a story, shooting at non-existent ships, friendly fishing boats getting blocked from the Suez Canal after firing on British fishing ships, thinking they were Japanese warships. The journey had taken them close to 6 months. But no sooner had they entered the Straits when calamity struck. Within a day, the Japanese Navy decimated the Russian fleet. The Baltic Fleet basically ceased to exist. At the cost of 5,000 deaths, 6 battleships and 1 coastal battleship and 14 other ships sunk, 5 further battleships surrendered to the Japanese. For their part, the Japanese suffered only 117 dead and 3 torpedo boats sunk. With 2 massive losses in the most significant battles of the war, the Russians were quickly willing to sue for peace. The Treaty of Portsmouth would be negotiated by US President Theodore Roosevelt. Russia was forced to cede its territorial claims in Manchuria, including Port Arthur, to Japan, and Russian forces were removed from Manchuria altogether. Japan, however, was not successful in achieving significant territorial gains. This provided actually more ammunition for the militarists in government to point to, showing the double standards that applied when Western rulers made these decisions. However, Japan did achieve recognition for their power and their influence in the world, which was at least one of their ambitions in empire building. Lastly, we want to consider the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1932. Now, we covered this already in our video on the League of Nations. Click the link just there. On September 18, 1931, a small explosion took out a section of Japanese-controlled railway in Manchuria. It was only a small explosion, and a train was able to travel over the line only minutes later. Japanese investigations said that this was the work of the Chinese, and so the Imperial Army pushed for war. Later historical analysis actually suggests that this was what we call a false flag event, that the Japanese had blown up their own railway in an attempt to find an excuse to invade China. Within Japan, the civil government tried to put an end to the conflict before it began. Even the emperor was initially opposed, but with the separation of powers between the army and the civil government under the Meiji Constitution, the army was free to act, and their successes, early successes, were enough to convince Hirohito to support the invasion. China, with really no other recourse, appealed to the League of Nations for support, but very little was forthcoming. A year-long investigation did confirm that Japan was at fault and ordered them to leave Manchuria. But by this time, the militarists had really gained power in Japan. They had had enough of the Western powers, who themselves had built empires, standing in the way of Japan building its own empire. The Japanese War in China, or the Second Sino-Soviet War, would continue until the defeat of Japan in World War II. It was a long and protracted struggle, one in which Japan was never truly able to win, despite its early successes. However, it does clearly highlight both their ambitions along with the failure of collective security and the League of Nations in preventing this from breaking out into a larger scale war. This has been History for the HSC and our deep dive into the features and the ambitions of the Japanese dictatorship. We hope you found this helpful. Please check the description below for links to the downloadable posters. Leave us some comments to let us know if you like this new format, any other suggestions you can make about how we could improve what we're doing. And we'll see you next time.